I have long believed that where there's problems in society, they have to be openly discussed. And before I get into the main subject of this video and what I'm going to be reading out, I just want to tap this a little bit into the video I was talking on disinformation, talking about regarding disinformation. I do believe that. I think that it is very, very, very important that disinformation is combated because in the worst case scenario it can directly lead to violence. And I think that's a problem across the world at the moment, disinformation being utilised for nefarious purposes. I mentioned the Maria Reza speech at the UN. And that does overlap with this subject. But I also believe that because something is taboo or controversial, it shouldn't be avoided. That's not enough of a reason to say, oh, we better not talk about that. And one such issue is race and crime. Actually, I was going to say in the United States, but actually in this country as well. The article I'm going to be reading out is specifically about the United States, but it certainly applies to the UK as well. Some similar themes exist. Not so much the issue of gun violence, thank goodness, but yes, race and crime is a factor in this country too. Okay, so I'm going to read this out. It's a piece from The Independent. It's about the murder of Irina Zarutska in the United States and how some conservatives are using her death to push about a focus on black on white crime, what they perceive as double standards on that. With the United States especially, even more so than the UK, there is of course the history there. This is always a powder keg situation in America. It's almost impossible to have a debate about this in the United States without it becoming tribalized, without people being accused of racism. And it is unfortunately something that it cannot just be calmly discussed. It's always a very inflammatory subject. And the sad thing about that is crime affects everyone. Anyone can be a victim of crime. White people, black people, Asian people, Hispanic people. And it's true in this country as well. Often communities that are most hit by crime, and groups that are often accused of committing crime, you'll find that the same communities often have the strongest views about security and indeed justice. So if you go to the south side of Chicago, you'll probably find black people there are concerned about crime and they do want to see justice. If you go to any predominantly white community in small town America that's been affected by a mass shooting, they'll want to see justice. Now, I'm going to read out the article. I don't agree with the angle they're taking. I think it's a very biased piece, the way it's written. I don't like the angle that they're taking. Nevertheless, there's some useful talking points. What I'm going to do, and I'll just say this from the outset, when I read through it, I am going to interject at several points because I want to, rather than commenting at the end and overlooking some of the things I want to say, I'll just interject at several points. Before I get into that article, I'm going to read out a case from the United States, and before that, bear with me, there's a few things I want to cover here. In the UK, we have 3 racist murders, whereby in each case there was an accusation that the media did not cover it the same as other racist murders. For example, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a young black man killed in London in 1993. Well, there were 3 other cases, and I'm going to do them in chronological order. The murder of Richard Everett in 1994, Somerstown, London. The murder of Ross Parker, Peterborough, 2001 in Peterborough, and the murder of Chris Donald in 2004 in Glasgow. So in those 3 cases, 3 different cities, Glasgow, London and Peterborough, 3 different years, you had a young white victim murdered by racist gangs. In the case of Chris Donald, the Asian gang that killed him got life sentences. Well, life by British standards, it isn't actually life. And I know that Princess Diana visited the shrine to Richard Everett, so that would have got a bit of attention at the time. But nevertheless, there was not mainstream coverage on the BBC regarding those crimes, not anywhere near the sort of coverage that you would get where a minority victim has been targeted. In the United States, I want to focus on the zebra murders. 1974. I'm just going to read this out before I get into the Independent article. This stuff, by the way, I'm not just throwing loads of stuff in. It's all relevant. This is an example of a racist crime in the United States that has largely been overlooked. And I did make a video on this a few years ago because I thought it was worth bringing attention to. The zebra murders were a string of racially motivated murders and related attacks committed by a group of 4 black serial killers in San Francisco from October 1973 to April 1974. They killed at least 15 white people and wounded 8 others. Police gave the case the name Zebra after the special police radio band they assigned to the investigation. Some authorities believe that the Death Angels, as the perpetrators called themselves, may have killed as many as 73 or more victims since 1970. Criminology professor Anthony Walsh wrote in a 2005 article that the San Francisco-based Death Angels may have killed more people in the early to mid-70s than all the other serial killers operating during that time period combined. In 1974, I don't know if that's just referring to the state of California or even nationwide. In 1974, a worker at the warehouse where the Death Angels were based testified to police for a reward, providing private details about the murders. Based on his evidence, 4 men were arrested in connection with the case. They were convicted in a jury trial of first-degree murder and conspiracy charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. The informant received immunity from prosecution for his testimony, and he, along with his family, was admitted to a witness protection program. 15 victims, up to 73 dead. Even in San Francisco, that case is not well remembered. I'm going to read out the names of the victims. Because very often we focus on killers and not the victims. This was the victims. Richard Haig, age 30, survived. Quita Haig, 28, died. Francis Rose, 28, died. I'm going to say killed because that's what it was. Robert Stuckman, 27, survived. Salim Erakat, killed. Paul Danchik, killed. Art Agnos, survived. Marietta Di Girolamo, killed. Ilario Bertuccio, killed. Therese Di Martini, survived. Neil Monaghan, killed. Mildred Hostler, killed. John Doe, this was an unidentified victim, killed. Tana Smith, killed. Vincent Wolin, killed. John Bambick, killed. Gin Holly, killed. Roxanne McMillan, survived. Thomas Rainwater, killed. Linda Story, survived. Terry White, survived. Ward Anderson, survived. Nelson Shields IV, killed. I remember those people who survived would have been haunted by this for years. There was another case involving a violent black perpetrator, Mark Essex, also known as the New Orleans Sniper. He was killed by police after killing 9 people, including 5 police officers, and wounding 12 others. And there's many other cases in the United States of black criminality. Now, of course, America's worst serial killer, Sam Little, was a black man. Now, in that case, most of his victims were black women, also some white and Hispanic women, but he is America's worst serial killer. So even the argument that most serial killers are white isn't entirely true. I'm going to read out the article from The Independent. Oh, by the way, and this is the last one I'll read out before getting to the main article, it's important to say, the official Black Lives Matter account has come under fire after posting a video earlier this week claiming that all oppressed people have a right to violence. This is coming from the Dallas Express. I'll put a link to the full article in my video. The post went up as the nation is still reeling from the brutal murder of 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee Irina Zarutska, who was stabbed to death on the North Carolina light rail train on August the 22nd by Carlos Brown, as the Dallas Express previously reported. Absolutely disgusting. That's by Joe Edwards at the Dallas Express. The Black Lives Matter think that's appropriate to actually try and justify violence. Abhorrent. Callous insult to Irina's boyfriend, to her family. Shame on Black Lives Matter. I'm going to read out the piece now from The Independent, and like I say, I will be interjecting as I read this out, because I take issue with some of the angle that they're going with on this. The reports by Aaron Morrison and Terry Tang. Train stabbing spurs outcry over black and white violence, but data shows occurrences are rare. After a Ukrainian woman who fled war in her home country was stabbed to death on a commuter train in North Carolina, the alarming act of violence ignited bitter racial and political rhetoric about crime victims and perpetrators in America. The fatal attack last month, in which the alleged perpetrator, that's obviously a legal term, but he done it, there's no question that he done it, was identified as a black man, evoked such visceral reactions, partly because it was caught on surveillance on a surveillance video that went viral online. On Tuesday, North Carolina's legislature passed a criminal justice package named after the victim to limit defendants' eligibility for bail and to encourage him to undergo mental health evaluations. A big controversy with that case was the judge, and I'm just saying it for the record, she was a black woman, releases violent criminal in order to commit this crime. She is not fit to be in her job. Rhetoric about the attack, including claims about black and white crime, has spread from social media and broadcast airwaves to the halls of Congress and the White House. Some of it leverages cherry-picked cases and ill-framed crime statistics to reproduce age-old harmful narratives about black criminality and threats to white populations. Now that line sounds more like an op-ed rather than just reading out a study on criminal violence. A piece about criminal violence, that sounds more like an op-ed. So, this report needs to decide what it is. Aaron Morrison and Terry Tang, what angle are you pushing? Because that is clearly an opinionated line that you've written there. Rhetoric about the attack, including claims about black and white crime, has spread from social media and broadcast airwaves to the halls of Congress and the White House. Some of it, that's what I've just read. It comes at a time when Republicans, including President Donald Trump, have been hyping the rhetoric as part of a focus on urban cities with reputations of violence. But despite the rhetoric, the data shows that in most US communities, victims of violence and offenders are usually the same race or ethnicity. One of the criticisms of Trump's approach actually is that most big American cities have seen falling crime for years, not actually escalating crime. In the case of New York City, it has increased somewhat from when it hit a low in, I believe it was the late 2000s, but still significantly lower than its peak in 1990, when New York City recorded over 2,000 murders. That was linked to the crack cocaine epidemic of that time. I mean, New York City hasn't come anywhere near that sort of level. Although I will say about New York City, there has been, again, and this gets into double standards, been a spate of attacks on young women by black men, just punching them in the face, and they get off on bail. It's sickening, actually. Violent incidents where the offenders and the victims are of different races is extremely uncommon, said Charisse Cooper, a criminology professor at the University of California, Irvine. It is the exception rather than the rule. People are more likely to be victimized by people they know and interact with regularly in their social sphere. She added, the most recent breakdown of federal crime statistics bears that out. Black offenders were involved in about 15% of violent victimizations of white people between 2017 and 2021, according to data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which publishes multi-year crimes trend reports every few years. White offenders were involved in over half of violence against other white people, the statistics show. I mean, that's something that isn't discussed as much as black on black crime, is white on white crime. The report showed similar trends when it came to violent crimes committed against black victims. White offenders were involved in about 12% of those crimes against black people, while black offenders were involved in 60% of violence against other black people. Now, it just skims over this point because this is an important point. I'll read that again. White offenders were involved in about 12% of those crimes against black people. 12%. That, by definition, means 88% were either black or Asian or other ethnic groups. It says actually black on black offenders, that was 60%. So let's break that down. White offenders 12, black offenders 60%. Roughly 38% will be other races like Asian on black or Hispanic on black. or perhaps not disclosed. Because in the United States, for example, Hispanic can mean white or black. It's not necessarily a race. But that's significant, 12%. Now, Black Lives Matter would have you believe that there's rampaging white supremacist mobs going around America killing black people, and that black people are only killed by white people, and that only corrupt white cops are killing black people. That's why I think Black Lives Matter is pretty toxic. They are very guilty of disinformation, because that's a narrative that they sow. You get really high profile cases like George Floyd, which naturally get a lot of attention, but Black Lives Matter doesn't seem to care about black on black crime. This has often been an allegation against them. I do think it's relevant, actually. When you pretend to be an organisation that is caring about lives and security and safety, then you can't just cherry pick the violence that you're talking about. That's why I take issue with this article, because the writers are talking about white conservative groups cherry picking crime, while the left does the same thing. Black Lives Matter does that precisely. So why are they not criticising Black Lives Matter for cherry picking? Right, so let's see, just where I got up to. What happened in Charlotte and the rhetoric around it? The August 22nd killing of 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee Irina Zarutska, and I had the misfortune to see that footage. It was horrible, horrible stuff. Became a flashpoint in online discussions about crime victims and race after surveillance video of the attack in Charlotte, North Carolina circulated widely online. Zarutska was knifed to death on the city's Lynx Blue Line light rail. Footage showed the alleged attacker pacing through the train and spreading the woman's blood on the floors of the train car. What a piece of shit. I'm just going to say that. That's how I feel. Might not be diplomatic, but that's how I feel about the guy. Piece of shit. DeCarlos Brown Jr., a black man, has been charged with first-degree murder and faces federal charges of committing an act causing death on a mass transportation system. Remember, Black Lives Matter thought it was appropriate to put up a video talking about right to violence. Remember that, for anyone who wants to defend Black Lives Matter. Conservative activists, including Trump political ally Charlie Kirk, were quick to call out what they decried as a double standard in reporting on such crimes by the mainstream media. Kirk once said on his popular podcast, "Prowling blacks go around for fun to target white people." Speaking about the Charlotte attack, Kirk said, "If a random white person on a subway took out a knife and stabbed a black girl senselessly to death, there would be massive media coverage." Now, I'll interject here again. Kirk was wrong about many things. I think he was dead wrong about the issue of gun violence. But, have to play fair, he wasn't wrong about this. If a white supremacist killed a black girl on a train and public transit, you could be damn sure there would be nationwide protests. Not just vigils, there would be protests. And there would be a huge discussion about white supremacy, and senior Democrats would be talking about that issue, even if it wasn't confirmed that that was definitely the motivation. Because another issue with this violence, where it involves one race and another race, is it's always perceived to be racism. Now, DeCarlos Brown, every decent person has condemned the crime, but the framework is he's mentally ill. Why was a mentally ill man allowed on public transit? If a white guy was mentally ill and done this to a black victim, no one would be talking about mental illness. They'd be talking about white supremacy. So absolutely, there is double standards in some of the narratives, without question. Kirk wasn't wrong about that. He wasn't wrong to point out that there would be double standards. And I remember the case at Oberlin College in the Midwest, where some white students were accused of racially abusing black students. It turned out to be totally made up. So again, this taps into the issue of disinformation. So Kirk wasn't wrong about that. There would be policy changes. We saw this in George Floyd, the 31-year-old said in his podcast the day before he was killed on a Utah University campus. And remember, Kirk was killed by a white man. So North Carolina Republicans also weighed in, some blaming what they called Democrats' woke policies on crime, including cashless bail, as a reason presumably dangerous people like Zarutska's alleged attacker were roaming free to pose threats to the public. On the issue of cherry picking on crime, and I'm going to say this before people accuse me of bias, The right also does it, and Charlie Kirk, I'm sure, done it. He was very wrong in my view on the issue of guns. The fact is, most mass shootings are committed by white men. So whilst the likes of Black Lives Matter are in denial about black criminality, the MAGA movement is in denial about white criminality. It's this crazy situation where you have a country that has a serious problem of violence, and both left and right are in denial or inconsistent at looking at overall violence. You know, people pushing agendas. Black Lives Matter and their white supporters will only talk about white supremacy. And MAGA will only talk about black criminality. They won't talk about white gun nuts. I mean, I think both are a problem. Certainly, the Bloods and the Crips in Los Angeles, they have terrorized that city for decades. They should be seen as terrorist groups. And you get people, they've been normalised in popular culture. They're thugs. There is a certain thing about wokeism in America. The political left think the word thug is racially motivated. The word thug simply means a violent and aggressive person. It actually comes from Imperial India. It comes from the Thuggy cult, which was a cult that allegedly went around strangling people. The actual historic veracity of that is uncertain, but anyway, that's where the word comes from. Thuggy, thug. And at least in the UK, it just means a violent person, attacks innocent people for no reason. In America, the woke left has said if you call a black criminal a thug, it's racialized. I will call a criminal a thug, whether they're black, white, Asian, or Hispanic. Criminals deserve to be called thugs. So if your first instinct is to defend the criminal, there's something seriously wrong with you. That's why I have no time for Black Lives Matter, because they've utterly failed to condemn criminality. Just continue the article. North Carolina Republicans. The North Carolina chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, a civil rights group that primarily advocates against anti-Muslim sentiments, said we also condemn those using this crime to resurrect racist talking points about the black community. We also condemn, so I assume they did condemn the murder of Irina Zarutska. I hope they did. The selective outrage is dangerous, hypocritical and racially motivated, especially given that white supremacists fall silent about other stabbings, mass shootings, hate crimes, financial crimes, rapes and various other misconduct committed by people of all races and backgrounds, the group said in a statement. They can include the President of the United States there. Donald Trump is a convicted felon. So they're right about that, but they're also being selectively, picking what violence they're talking about. Black Lives Matter cherry picks on violence, comparing black on white crime on white on black crime. Some criminologists caution against relying on raw crime numbers as it relates to the race of victims and offenders because population size matters. Non-Hispanic black people made up roughly 13% of the US population in 2024, according to census estimates. Non-Hispanic white people make up the largest racial group in the US and estimate 56% of the total population in 2024. So they're just more white people that could be potential offenders, Kuprin said. Okay, but that's just raw numbers. It doesn't necessarily talk about proportionality. That disregards that point. It's a bit like saying, I've heard the argument here, there was a councillor in Nottingham decried the fact that Nottingham was said to have a higher murder rate than London. And she said, oh, but London's much bigger than Nottingham. People don't seem to understand this issue of proportionality, per capita, etc. So if, there's a higher proportion of crimes committed by black people when they have a smaller population, that's an issue. If there's a higher proportion of white mass shooters, that's an issue. This issue of proportionality needs to really be looked at. The National Criminal Victimization Survey conducted in 2023 by the Justice Department gathered data on nearly 6 million violent incidents reported by law enforcement. Their findings show over 3.5 million involved a white victim. White offenders were involved in more than half of those crimes, while only 1/10 involved black offenders. When a killing or violent interaction between people of different races grabs the headlines in social media, especially if there is video, it's tempting to use that as confirmation of preconceived notion that black and white crime or vice versa are suddenly spiking, Kuprin said. but in reality they make up a small share of hundreds of thousands of violent crimes, mostly involving people of the same race, she said. And she's probably right about that, but the issue here is not how regularly it occurs, it's how it's dealt with. You know, when you get black guys attacking white women in New York City and they're getting a tap on the wrist, that's clearly wrong. I mean, there is absolutely double standards in how these things are, and of course each state has its own laws, but that's why conservatives are galvanised. Now, again, I say they're guilty of underplaying white mass shooters, but the left are guilty of bringing woke language policing into this. I cited the thing about using the word thug. You know, if someone says the black thug attacked the cashier, why is that racist? If the offender happens to be black, he's committing a violent act. He is a thug, and it's legitimate to call him that. That's one thing I really don't like about the American woke left. They care more about words than they do about actual violence. Let's see. Brett Solomon, Executive Director of Right on Crime, a conservative criminal justice group, thinks people should not focus on race, but rather where violent crimes are happening the most. Even if data shows crime has been on a downward trend, that can be of little comfort to people constantly feeling unsafe, he says. That's absolutely true. Let's start making about communities that want to feel safe, Tolman said. I hear from just as many that are living in inner cities, regardless of the politics, that they want safety and security. Examining black on black crime. Black on black crime is a flawed premise, according to criminologists, because people of all racial groups experience crime due to their social networks and proximity to each other. Well, it's not a flawed premise as it pertains to Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter cherry pick it. You know, they ignore that issue completely, and yet they focus on police brutality. They even make it about white supremacy when it's black police officers involved in the brutality, which more often than not it is. So, you know, it does pertain to that when you have a significant and influential social campaign group like Black Lives Matter engaging in blatant hypocrisy. You know, they say they're about Black Lives Mattering, but they don't seem to care when the black lives are taken by other black people. But in discussions about systemic racism and policing in the criminal justice system, it's frequently argued that black on black crime should be the chief concern of black communities, more than police brutality or racial profiling, because homicide has been a leading cause of death among black men. Even as crime rates have fallen dramatically for white and black populations over time, misinformed rhetoric around crime and violence perpetuates racialized narratives on the issues, said Tremaine Lee, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who recently published a book about gun violence, 1,000 Ways to Die. When you have a nation so bound by violence as the United States, it's only a matter of time that binding snaps and lashes at us all, he said, adding that violence isn't the domain of black Americans alone. Well, any honest observer would say that. Of course it's not just black Americans. But the thing is, black campaign groups would try to deny black criminality altogether, or when it does happen, they would even cite things such as black rage. This has actually been attempted to be used as a criminal defence. This idea that a violent black perpetrator has just felt so enraged by centuries of oppression that, he just had to lash out. That was actually cited in the Long Island train mass shooting in 1993. Black rage. When you have a nation so bound, I've read that. Even though the politics of the moment might suggest differently, this is a stark reminder that no American is out of reach of American violence. It's very true. And that's what Robert F. Kennedy Sr. said before he was assassinated. He made a very famous speech, The Mindless Menace of Violence in America, a very powerful speech. Okay, so there's obviously a lot to unpack there. I won't add too much more to this because I did interject where I wanted to. But I'll simply say this. Violence is obviously a problem in the United States, and it's why I don't think we should take any lectures from MAGA politicians on violence at all. But the danger with the United States, as I see it, I'm an outsider, the UK is not totally immune from this, is that both sides are playing a game. Both sides are cherry picking what sort of violence they're looking at. The left are guilty of trying to downplay the issue of black violence as it pertains to predominantly black communities. I mean, it's not that this issue is ignored, but it is ignored by the likes of Black Lives Matter, which white liberals absolutely endorse. And anyone who talks about it is accused of dog whistle politics, of harmful black stereotypes. Well, quite frankly, if Black Lives Matter fails to condemn that, they can't really complain about harmful black stereotypes. Because that is a serious problem in many inner cities in the United States. You can go to St. Louis, Chicago, Baltimore, and that is a problem. Now, the violence in American cities isn't such that it justifies what Donald Trump's doing. He's, sending in federal troops for political reasons. Those cities, whilst they do have problems, is not historically high problems. It's not the sort of violence those cities experienced in the 1970s. So that's a misconception from the White House. It is for political reasons. Having said that, the Democrat record on crime is nothing to shout about at all. And it's something that I think will affect Governor Newsom if he's a Democratic nominee in 2028. His record as Governor of California will be heavily scrutinised, and rightly so. Now, I say that the left cherry pick on that. Black Lives Matter fail to condemn criminality. But the right are also guilty of this. You had the Vice President of the United States absurdly, inflaming the rhetoric by saying that only the left have committed crime in this country. That's a barefaced lie. When you had violent insurrectionists attacking the US Capitol. So it's a crazy situation. You have Black Lives Matter rioting all over the country after George Floyd, and you have Trump supporters rioting because they are sore losers. I think both sides have violence on the record. But I do think that MAGA and Trump specifically, you've seen that normalise at executive level. Much, much worse than either Obama or Biden. Maybe Obama and Biden can be accused of somewhat pitching to the woke element of their parties, but no one can honestly say that Biden or Obama ever tried to justify criminality. I've never seen any evidence of that. In fact, Joe Biden, as a legislator, his record was quite hardline on crime. So was Kamala Harris. She was a prosecutor. That's the irony. She was a prosecutor and her rival was a convicted felon. So the Republicans can certainly not claim to be the party of law and order when, they have a criminal as president. It's just ridiculous. They have no moral authority on this whatsoever. Charlie Kirk and other MAGA Republicans are utterly, utterly tone deaf on the issue of gun violence. Whenever that happens, it's thoughts and prayers. Let's not talk about guns. So both sides are guilty, actually. I mean, and again, I probably won't win much support for this because I'm condemning both sides, but it's a fact. Black Lives Matter, they obsess about white supremacy and police brutality, but they do turn a blind eye to black criminality. And the problem is if any white person talks about that, they're immediately accused of racism. Now, I don't say that only black Americans are involved in crime. There's plenty of examples of white Americans involved in crime. But I do say that when you have a movement like wanting to ignore the issue, that is a problem. Particularly when that movement is focusing on what they claim to be inherent institutional racism. Unfortunately, I think this is always going to be a toxic issue in the United States. But decent people everywhere, I don't care if you're black, white, Asian or Hispanic, you should have the decency to condemn criminals and not try to defend or downplay those criminals just because they're the same race as you. And frankly, too many African Americans try to find excuses for black criminals. Too many MAGA white Republicans try to find excuses for white criminals, i.e. the January 6th insurrectionists. So as long as those double standards continue in that polarised, tribalised way, it's a problem. But the woke left are not helping matters either with their language policing by saying, oh, you can't talk about black crime. Well, actually, it's very valid to talk about it. And it's very valid to talk about white supremacy. When you had a white supremacist thug like Dylan Roof going into a black church and killing innocent, unarmed people, that's horrendous. There was another massacre in Buffalo, New York. So, absolutely, minorities are the victims of hate crimes in the United States. But so are white people. This also happens, and I think the anger from the conservative side is the liberal media just won't cover it in the same way. They won't. So Kirk wasn't wrong to say that the reaction, if it had been a white man and a black woman, would be very different. I even would argue if you had, say, a violent incident in a big city like New York, I'm not sure what the racial makeup of Charlotte is, but certainly in New York City, there was a case a few years ago where a white guy, I think he was an off-duty Marine, intervened, a black guy was acting violently. Now that is living proof of why there are groups out there that will racialise things. They immediately try to call him a racist because he was trying to be a good citizen. He was trying to apprehend a violent individual who was threatening others. And you had black groups talking about the racism. You know, I think that some of these black groups, they are only interested in pushing a narrative about racism. They don't seem to care about innocent victims of crime. Unless, of course, it's black victims of race crime, but otherwise they don't give a damn. Because if they did, they would be a lot more vocal on black crime. If MAGA Republicans really care about crime, they would be a lot more vocal on white mass shooters, but they're not. So both sides are hypocritical. And with that charming thought, I'm going to leave it there because I really have covered a lot here. 36 minutes. I try not to go into this sort of time frame, but I think it was all important to cover. I'll put links to the things I've been talking about.